Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Smith. I'm Housing Policy Director with 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin, and we are about to begin shortly. In just a moment, the folks at Stevens Point will kick us off. You guys are muted. You're muted.
There, unmute for Zoom. There we go.
All right. Welcome everybody yet again to the Let's Talk Parking event at the Portage County Public Library. Welcome. My name is Eric Fonts and I write for the Stevens Point Journal, which is a part of the USA Today Network, Wisconsin. And I am here to help facilitate the meeting. I tell people regularly that I want to have more public conversations about difficult topics, and here's one chance to do that. And so we have a schedule ahead of us. We're going to do some introductions, and we'll hear a presentation, and then we'll do a discussion with the panel starting around 5:50, and we hope to wrap up around 6:30. Yeah, and I guess, primarily we are here to listen and learn and ask questions. And we'd like to be respectful both to each other in the room and to our panelists who were so gracious to give their time and to sit up here in front of everybody for us. And we also want to, if you're asking a question, we want to speak up. Same for the panelists. We have an audience online, and so we also want to include them in this conversation. And I just have a couple things about listening, because I learned about active listening in my training to become a reporter. And so just wanted to share that Merriam-Webster defines listening with 3 different definitions. The first one is to pay attention to sound. The second is to hear something with thoughtful attention. And the third is to be alert and to catch an expected sound. And similarly, researchers at Harvard University offered, why should you care about listening? And 5 of the things that they said can come from listening is helping to assess value of information, understanding others' perspectives, finding common ground, building trust, and creating conditions for reciprocity. And so I hope we can get some of that stuff out of our discussion here this evening. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ken Smith, who is 1,000 Friends Housing Policy Director, and he will give us another introduction.
Thanks, Eric. So as Eric mentioned, I'm Ken Smith, Housing Policy Director with 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin. One of the movement that I'm a part of, a 3-member team, is the Housing Onward Wisconsin movement. And we are all about more housing, more affordable housing, and more housing types, particularly as it relates to land use and zoning policy. And that's not all we do here at 1,000 Friends. We do, broadly speaking, land use and transportation policy. We have a 7-member staff scattered all over this great state and addressing these very issues, from a community transportation academy, a community housing academy, which will begin this September at the first location in Milwaukee. And we pride ourselves in this organization on being founded 30 years ago to fight sprawl. And for those of you familiar with comprehensive land use planning, that is an initiative that our organization was a part of. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our executive director, Trevor Rourke, who is based out of Stevens Point, and I will let him take it from here.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks everyone for coming. Who's excited about parking? I knew that would happen. Yeah, we're all excited. That's why we're here. So thank you for joining us, 1000 Friends, Parking Reform Network, and our awesome panelists tonight. We are looking forward to having a healthy discussion. I'm going to introduce Daniel. So Daniel Herriges is the policy director at Parking Reform Network. He is a longtime advocate for policy change to create more sustainable, walkable, and lively cities and towns. Prior to coming to Parking Reform Network, Daniel was the editor-in-chief at Strong Towns, where he co-authored the book Escaping the Housing Trap, the Strong Towns Response to the Housing Crisis. Daniel has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Minnesota, and he lives in St. Paul with his wife and 2 children. Well, everyone, let's please give a round of applause and welcome Daniel.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks for having me. I'm going to hope the folks on Zoom can hear okay. We tried to test the audio as we were getting the room set up. And without further ado, I am going to share my slides and talk a little bit about parking reform, what it is, and why you should care. All right. I am, as Trevor said, the policy director at the Parking Reform Network. We're a small national nonprofit that works to accelerate parking reform, essentially as a convener. Our goal is to educate the public, to educate policymakers, to connect advocates with each other, coalition build, and just sort of raise the level of discourse around parking policy, which is something that most people think of as kind of dry and obscure, but it's actually sort of the dark matter that influences absolutely everything about how your city is built and how it works. Our work at PRN is really heavily indebted to the work of Professor Donald Shoup. The late Donald Shoup was an economics professor at UCLA who almost single-handedly pioneered the study of parking, the economics and public policy of it at a time when very few of his peers in academia thought that parking was worthy of study. He's best known as the author of The High Cost of Free Parking, which is a fantastic book. It's also an 800-page book. I don't recommend reading it cover to cover, but it is the Bible of parking policy of everything that we do, and has been tremendously influential on the planning profession and on urbanist reform advocacy. Why is there a need for parking reform? What do we mean by parking reform? If you ask most people, does your town have a parking problem? What they think that means is, can you find parking when you want to? And often the answer is, well, sometimes not. I remember the last time I couldn't. It was really frustrating. I remember the last time I had to pay more for parking than I wanted to pay. It was really frustrating. If you ask the average American, sort of out of context, how do you feel about free parking? The overwhelming majority answer is going to be, yeah, it's great. Parking should be available whenever I want to park my car. It should be easy to get to. It should be free. Why not? And the problem is that we don't look at the other side of the equation, which is that oversupplying parking and requiring parking in really inflexible ways has a whole bunch of negative effects on our cities and on society that aren't really part of the balance sheet when people are thinking about parking, because they're born indirectly. They're not something you're necessarily aware that you're paying, but you are paying for supposedly free parking in the form of the cost that it took to construct it, which gets passed on to the cost of housing, to the costs borne by a small business owner. You're paying for it in your retail prices. You're paying for the land that is taken up by parking, for the maintenance of the public infrastructure, and for the things that are displaced by that parking. Parking is not bad. Cars are not bad. Needing to park a car is not bad. And so I'm not here to give you an anti-parking or an anti-car screed today. What I am going to talk about is trade-offs and why those trade-offs are so important to get right, and why public policy for the last 70 plus years in North America has very systematically gotten them wrong. Excuse me. So first I'm going to talk about parking mandates, which are requirements that are ubiquitous in the local zoning code of nearly every city and town of every size across this country. And they dictate in great detail how much off-street parking every home, every apartment building, every business of every type needs to provide. And that's not the case all over the world that you have these policies, and it wasn't always the case in America. Parking mandates arose post-World War II as a reaction by the city planning profession to all of a sudden the fact that everybody seemed to own a car. You had a massive increase really, really quickly in private vehicle ownership. And this created huge problems in old cities. You know, think New York, think Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, places that hadn't been designed around the assumption that everyone would have a car. So you had massive congestion. You had people looking for parking, circling the block over and over, trying to find it. And the response was, well, let's make sure that everybody provides enough parking. And from the get-go, planners admitted that they didn't actually know what constituted enough parking. This is a memo from what became the American Planning Association from 1954 that says, it is doubtful. I just realized that my slides are obscured by the video thumbnail. There we go. Sorry about that. You know, it's doubtful if any two planners or architects could agree on how much parking we actually need. There's a question in my mind if there ever will be a correct answer. And so the answer that they tended to arrive at and that became institutionalized in policy in city after city was, let's err on the side of oversupply. Let's guess, you know, let's figure out how much parking a retail business might need on the busiest shopping day of the year. This is rush hour on the day before Christmas, or, you know, I've heard Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, often gets brought up in this context. But what's the maximum amount of parking that you will ever need? And let's make sure everybody supplies that. And so I'll go to that slide in a second. But so we end up with these really, really specific mandates that are in the zoning code that are broken down by every conceivable type of business and that are frankly guesswork because there isn't a single answer to how much parking do you need. And the best illustration of the level of guesswork that was actually involved in these codes is to take a particular land use and do a survey of parking requirements across a bunch of different municipalities. We like to use bowling alleys for this. You know, parking mandates proliferated in the 1970s and bowling was kind of having a cultural moment. So almost every town has a specific parking requirement for bowling alleys. And if these were based on some sort of science, some sort of empirical study of how much parking bowling customers tend to use, then you wouldn't see this. This is just a random sampling. Well, not random, but it's a sampling of parking requirements for bowling alleys in towns in Wisconsin. Now, why is it that in Menominee you need 7 parking spaces per lane at a bowling alley, but in Reedsville you need 2? And here you need 5 plus 1 for every 100 square feet of conference, banquet, or restaurant area. I mean, someone came up with this. There was probably some logic involved. There was maybe a bit of guesswork. There was maybe a study with a couple data points. This is something that comes out of Donald Shoup's work, is that the actual evidentiary basis for these requirements is incredibly slim. It's planners guessing and erring on the side of, well, when in doubt, let's just make sure they have enough parking. So you can do this for other land uses, funeral homes. Again, a funeral home, you just within Wisconsin, you see a range from 1 per 50 square feet of floor area to 1 per 1,500 to everywhere in between. This is completely arbitrary policymaking. And the arbitrariness is the norm, not the exception. I'm not cherry picking just bowling alleys and funeral homes. You can go down land uses and you can find this kind of spread. And you can find some really oddball ones if you look around. 1 stall per 100 square feet for a haunted house in Gilbert, Arizona. 100 square feet, that's a 10 by 10 foot square. Think about the size of the parking relative to the size of the haunted house if you were to actually do this. My guess is that no one has built a haunted house in Gilbert, Arizona under this code. Carver, Massachusetts, a cemetery in Carver requires 1 parking space per 8 occupants. We did contact the city and they did confirm that occupants here refers to the deceased. There's, you know, numbers that are really precise tend to have this veneer of scientific authority. And you'll get that here where planners will push back on some of this stuff and they'll say, well, we have parking standards and our standards were carefully devised to meet the community's needs. And Well, okay, so Woodbury, Georgia, which is a small town known for being a filming site for The Walking Dead. It's a little bit outside of Atlanta. Woodbury, Georgia requires 4 parking spaces per hospital bed plus 0.72 per employee. That is a very precise standard. It's not correct. It's not reliable, but it's precise. Woodbury, interestingly, also has separate parking requirements for a heliport and a helistop in their code. What's the difference between a heliport and a helistop? Hell if I know. Have to stick the hokey dad joke in there. But this is no laughing matter because the actual consequences of getting this wrong on the ground are really, really significant. And that is why we have a parking reform movement. Parking is expensive, more so than most people realize. These are ballpark figures for how much it costs to build a single parking space. In a surface lot, thousands of dollars. In a garage, tens of thousands. And roughly double that if the garage is underground. We have documented examples of parking space construction costs over $80,000 a stall. And in fact, UCLA published an analysis this year where they interviewed developers about their parking costs across 17 cities. And they found the average cost of building a parking space in an above ground garage is $52,000. In an underground garage, they found 73. You have a large range depending on soil conditions, all sorts of site factors, cost of materials, but it's a very, very significant amount of money. And that money is being passed on to the end customers of that building. There is no such thing as free parking. Someone is paying for this. In the case of residential parking, the tenant is paying for it. When your total construction costs go up by 20 or 30 or close to 40% per apartment, that's going to affect the cost of the apartments that you are able to profitably build and rent out, and the housing that is available to people in the community. A good rule of thumb for thinking about this is that $1,000 in construction costs translates to about $10 in monthly rent. So a $50,000 parking space, that's $500 in rent that someone is paying. The tenant might not see that as a line item on their rent check, but make no mistake, the developer is making up that money because they have to pay off their construction loan. And if they can't make it up, they're probably not building the building. And there is research that finds that residential parking is often oversupplied. So these numbers matter. This isn't just necessary parking that is being used by the resident. The Metro Area Planning Commission in Metro Boston did a survey of over 200 apartment buildings in the city, in the suburbs, in a wide range of areas. And they found that on average, in the middle of the night, when you expect people to be home, you expect kind of maximum occupancy at about 4 a.m. at an apartment building, 3 out of 10 spaces were sitting empty. And we're building more parking than people actually have cars. You can pull numbers from the census. In the state of Wisconsin, 66% of renter households have either no vehicle or one vehicle. In Stevens Point, the number is pretty close to that. We have 57% have either 0 or 1 vehicle. Now, I pulled up the zoning code for Stevens Point, and if you look at the categories here for multifamily living, what you see is more than 1 parking space per apartment unit, and it goes up a little bit depending on the number of bedrooms. Now, you will have households that are using all that parking, but you also, given these numbers from the census, you clearly have households that aren't. So who's paying for it? And parking determines what is feasible to build at all. And because of the economics of a project where you're trying to come up with a building that will fit on a piece of land, you're trying to figure out how all your construction costs kind of bundle together into something that you can make money on at the end of the day. Parking tends to tip that math in weird ways. So we have examples like this study that was done in Portland, Oregon, where simply tweaking the parking requirement from half a stall per apartment to 1 stall per apartment, all of a sudden, in the most profitable thing to build on this lot, instead of being 32 modestly priced apartments at about $280,000 each, all of a sudden it's 10 much larger townhomes at $733,000 each. So parking requirements can very easily take modest, affordable homes off the table. Or can just make them geometrically infeasible because parking takes up a lot of space In the cities of Los Angeles and Kansas City, parking occupies more total land than housing. And I'm sure those two aren't alone. Those are just two where someone has crunched the numbers. More space devoted to housing cars than to housing people. And on the commercial side, you see a similar thing. These are very typical, commonplace commercial parking requirements. One space per 500 square feet of floor area. One space per 250 square feet of floor area, designed to ensure that at maximum capacity, this business can accommodate all of its parking needs. Well, what happens once you get under 300 square feet, which is about the land required for a parking stall, the parking lot, you're requiring in your code that the parking lot be bigger than the building. That surprises people when you tell it to them, but you can see it very quickly if you go on Google Maps or something, look at aerial photos. The commercial parking is very often larger than the building itself. Your typical Walmart has a parking lot more than twice the size of the store. So it's a huge amount of land. And it's taking all the actual destinations, all the actual places where people are employed, where people meet their needs, where the community builds wealth, and it's pushing them farther and farther apart from each other. And that feeds traffic, which demands bigger roads, which encourages more driving, more congestion. It ends up becoming kind of a vicious cycle. And in fact, parking tends to perpetuate the need for itself. Once you get into really high parking ratios, it makes the environment so inhospitable to get around any means other than in a car that you get something like this, where to run a handful of errands after work now, you want to get your groceries, you want to go to the bank, you want to go out to dinner. In a typical kind of suburban shopping plaza environment, you're now driving and parking 5 times in order to do something that on a more traditional main street, you might have parked once and then accomplished all those things on foot. So parking perpetuates the need for more parking when you get to the point where parking is making the environment unwalkable. So we have sort of a wholesale transformation of the urban form that has occurred in the decades since the middle of the 20th century, from the human scale to the automobile scale. These are both local photos. The one on the left is your downtown here in Stevens Point. The one on the right is by the Menards in Plover. And I want you to kind of look at them and just like counting rooftops, think about how many value producing businesses are in the photo on the left, how many people are employed, how many local owners keeping wealth in the community in that Main Street district. And then look at the right and how much of the area in that photo on the right actually consists of businesses that are employing people, that are creating jobs, that are generating wealth, that are generating revenue for the community in the form of tax base. There's a huge imbalance. And that imbalance, more than anything else, is due to giving over so much of our land area to the storage of cars, far in excess of what's actually needed to accommodate people's ability to get what they want and get where they want. And this is worst for non-drivers. We always plug this book in our talks. Anna Zevarts is the founder of Disability Rights Washington. She lives in Seattle. Has been a really powerful, really concerted advocate for considering the needs and the rights of non-drivers in the built environment. And non-drivers aren't just people with disabilities. Non-drivers are children. Non-drivers are older people who don't feel comfortable driving to meet their needs anymore. It's a huge range of people. Non-drivers includes people who can't afford to own a car or simply don't want to. It's about 30% of Americans. And parking requirements are maybe the single biggest reason that we have an environment that is really, really inhospitable to that 30% of Americans. Parking eats up way more land than we think it does. At PRN, we create these parking lot maps. We have a team of volunteers that do these, where they'll take you downtown. We unfortunately don't have one for Stevens Point. It's really volunteer driven. You know, we encourage people to get involved. If they're doing this, you know, we try to collect more and more of them. But parking, all the red here is either surface parking lots or it's land devoted solely to parking. So it might be a garage that doesn't have any other sort of building on top. It's a lot of land. And in terms of your community's property tax base, which is really its ability to fund itself, to fund local government and all public services, you can think of that 20, 30, sometimes 40% of land as effectively dead weight. I mean, you need parking because people need to drive and park places. But that's not where your community's wealth is. That's not where your productivity is. That's not where your vibrancy is. It's necessary to have those other things, but we are overbuilding it to a catastrophic extent. I'm aware of time here, and I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit. Urban 3, consulting firm out of North Carolina, does these great tax-based analyses where they look at the value per acre. Think of it as like agricultural yield. It's, how much yield are you getting out of a piece of land in an urban setting? How much value is being created relative to the size of the land? Because land is something they're not making more of. And what we see is, if you look on the left there, properties, like that Walmart store where a lot of the land use is parking, that parking represents a huge drag on the overall tax-based productivity of that land. Parking mandates harm small businesses, including those that provide vital services. We've amassed, a whole bunch of stories of this over the years in our advocacy and through people coming to us. This is the owner of a senior care center. This is Melissa Bruce. She owned a residential care home in Portland that had a waiting list. She had 12 beds, and she could only have 5 patients because of the parking requirements for the city, which was based on her occupancy. This is end of life care. These are not patients who drive. Another example, childcare is scarce in a lot of communities, is expensive, is a huge drain on a lot of families' budgets. Childcare centers are often harmed by parking requirements. Dana Christensen had been a daycare center owner in Washington State for 24 years, had successfully owned a center operating with 8 parking spaces, went to open another location in the next city over. They were going to make her have 32. She couldn't do it. She had to scrap the plans. Stories like these are everywhere. I guarantee they exist in your community. Parking requirements end up just being really, really punitive for local entrepreneurs. For just about every kind of goal, that you might have as a community, there is some way in which inflexible parking requirements are probably undermining that goal. They're adding to traffic. Parking is the single largest source of polluted runoff when it rains. Everything that's on that asphalt, everything leaking out of the cars, particulate matter from the tires, all of that is runoff that's going into your rivers and streams. Asphalt gets hot when you have increasingly frequent summer heat waves. It's a huge contributor to unhealthy levels of urban heat. For that reason, we have found at the Parking Reform Network that we see these amazing coalitions sprout up around right-sizing parking and fixing these inflexible arbitrary parking mandates. Just an incredible diversity of organizations with a diversity of causes find that parking is basically the reason they can't have the thing they want. It's why we can't have nice things. And so we see these coalitions form increasingly to demand reform of these policies. What does that movement look like? Well, we keep track of the number of US cities that have abolished their off-street parking requirements. In 2016, that number was 0. Now it's 116 and growing. It has been exponential over the last few years. And a lot of those cities are small. This is not just a phenomenon for the New Yorks of the world that have A+ public transit. A lot of small towns, a lot of college towns. This is really widespread because the harms of parking mandates aren't confined to places where people have the option to not own a car at all or to never drive. They are also harming your economic vitality, harming local entrepreneurs, harming people who need housing in communities where you are going to have a car and you are going to drive. We're seeing a statewide reform push increasingly as well. Washington, Montana, Colorado, Connecticut, a number of states have passed significant rollbacks of parking requirements. So essentially what that does is it tells cities, it places a guardrail on cities. If you're going to require parking, you either can't do it for these land uses, you can't do it near mass transit stations, or you can only have the requirement set so high. North Carolina this year passed a law that applies to 90% of the state and abolishes these requirements entirely. And this push was led by Catawba Riverkeeper, which is a water quality organization. The sponsors of the bill were a bipartisan group of sponsors. A couple of them were lifelong farmers who were seeing firsthand the effect of polluted runoff from North Carolina's big cities. And, determined to tackle this problem of water quality, they went after parking requirements and they got a unanimous vote in the House and a 44-1 vote in the Senate to abolish off-street parking requirements in almost all of North Carolina. They carved out one section of the state. So there's a huge amount of momentum around this issue. And I think that speaks to the sheer number of needs and priorities that it touches. If you don't require people to build X number of off-street parking spaces, the question I get, the number one question is always, well, what happens when they don't build enough? Sooner or later, someone's going to not build enough parking, and those people are going to spill over onto the public street. And so I'm going to talk briefly about the other side of the equation, which is parking management. Because our position at PRN is the government should mind their own business when it comes to parking. And that's not just some hardcore, libertarian, get government out of my parking. No, a lot of things are the local government's business. So even in the absence of requiring an arbitrary quota of off-street parking on private property, you can still control who parks on public streets, who's allowed to, for how long, what they have to pay. You can regulate design features of parking to make sure you have landscaping, stormwater retention, etc. You can still require ADA accessibility when people build parking. You can still require reasonable accommodations for things like pickup and drop off or DoorDash delivery. You can address all of this. You just have to actually address it as a matter of public policy instead of pushing the burden onto each individual private property owner. You often hear the complaint, people go looking for parking somewhere, they end up circling the block, they throw their hands up. There's literally no parking. I'm not going to tell the story just in the interest of time behind this particular slide. It's entirely possible to have two parking problems at the same time in your community, and I suspect this is true here in Point. You have too much parking as a city, and yet you have places and times when people want parking and they struggle to find it, or it's not convenient. Those are completely compatible problems. So parking management is actually often about creating the match between the person who needs parking and where they can get it. Making it legible, where do you actually go to park? Sometimes it's as simple as wayfinding. Like there's actually a huge lot that's underused 2 blocks away. Instead of people circling the block over here, can we direct them to it? Can we give them an incentive to use it? A lot of your traffic in a busy commercial area is people cruising for a parking space. It creates congestion, it's unpleasant, it's stressful for the people doing it. You can address this through on-street management. Donald Shoup really pioneered the study of this, coming up with the 85% rule. 85% occupancy on a public curb basically translates to 1 parking space open per block. That means no matter what block you're going to, you can find a parking space that's available within a block of your destination. The average Walmart parking lot, you might very well be walking farther than 1 city block just from your car to the store. How do you ensure this availability? You set the price. In a place where parking is actually congested and in high demand, you charge people to park. And you adjust that price based on occupancy, targeting that 85%. If your parking is always full, you're not charging enough. If it's always empty, maybe you could stand to charge less or not at all. So the right price actually leaves a space open for the people who need to park. They're just going to pay a little bit for it, but they're going to get value for that money. This is actually good for drivers too. You can actually improve the reliable availability of parking by charging for it. Just as, we don't balk at charging for any number of other things that people need. And we don't balk at charging based on demand. We don't insist that airlines charge the same amount for a plane ticket the day before Thanksgiving that they do on like a random Thursday in April. Price is a mechanism to control the availability of something and make sure that those who need it can have it. And charging for parking creates a pot of money that you can use to reinvest back in your community. You can have a parking benefit district where it's actually invested hyper locally in that neighborhood, in that commercial district, in things that serve mobility needs, in things that actually, very often we see sidewalk improvements, street lighting, public safety improvements, benches so that people can rest. You can pay for that by charging for parking, and you actually create a virtuous cycle. And often we see business owners get on board with a parking benefit district because they see the benefit now in the revitalization of their business district. And the big thing I'll stress, just to wrap up here, is when parking mandates go away, parking doesn't go away. When people hear eliminate parking mandates, they hear eliminate parking, and half the time their brain shuts off and they go, this is crazy. What are you talking about? We're still going to have cars tomorrow. Yes, you are. And you're still going to have parking tomorrow. You wake up the next day after your city has voted to eliminate parking mandates, you have the same city. But over time, what you have done is you've granted flexibility back to the property owner, who is the most qualified to determine how much parking they need. And you've given them an ability to make a different set of choices based on their situation. And so we've studied cities that have gotten rid of parking requirements. And what we see is that most developers build parking. Most new homes permitted after major parking reforms in Seattle and Buffalo still included parking. The vast majority did. But the majority of new homes permitted in those cities after those reforms would have been illegal under the prior zoning code. So you're creating options that weren't there. Minneapolis got rid of its parking requirements in 2018, and they made a couple incremental reforms prior to that. And what we've seen is that decision-making adjusts gradually and over time. Home builders don't just stop building parking. Businesses don't just stop providing parking. They know that their tenants drive. They know that their customers drive. There are still cars in the city. But what you see is a greater range of choices being made. So if you compare Minneapolis in 2011 to Minneapolis in 2023, there's still plenty of parking being built, but you have new buildings going up with little or no parking in environments where that's an appropriate option. Near the core of the city, near mass transit lines where you can walk to a lot of your destinations, you can now build a 6-unit or an 8-unit apartment building, not provide any parking, and trust that your tenants will figure it out. That either tenants who don't need a parking space will live in your building, tenants who care a lot about having a parking space will live somewhere else, or that they'll park on the street and they'll figure it out. But you're giving flexibility, you're giving options back to people instead of the one-size-fits-all approach of every single private property must have enough parking for every conceivable need. You can do more in the same space. You can produce more wealth, more vibrancy, more vitality. You can provide more access, new kinds of businesses, new kinds of buildings. You can facilitate missing middle housing, starter homes, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, which you may know as backyard in-law cottages or granny flats. In a lot of West Coast cities, we've seen them absolutely explode. They've become an incredibly popular way of providing housing that's appropriate for a young professional or for a senior citizen aging in place, because it's modest in size and it's modest in cost. Parking reform is the absolute key to making this possible. You can see shopping centers with a big unused parking lot actually break up that space, start to redevelop some of it, put in new businesses, or put in housing. This is an example from suburban Dallas, Texas. Tremendous value that can be created when you're not saddled with parking requirements that are too large and too inflexible for your actual situation. Trade-offs don't go away. You still need to accommodate cars. People still need to park. Sometimes people will have trouble finding parking. Sometimes you will have conflicts in your community resulting from access to parking. So, this doesn't magically get rid of that trade-off. It's just a question of what we want to prioritize. And when the thing that we prioritize above all else is make sure there is more than enough parking at all times and that it's free, there's a lot that we lose. Thank you. I believe we're going to go to our panel, and I've been told to change my audio input setting here to the room microphones, so hopefully it will be audible. Also, I think to rotate and put it around the base of it. See how that goes. Not sure. Okay, yeah, that looks reasonable, right? I don't know if anyone will be able to hear on Zoom. No.
All right. Well, thank you, Danielle, for the informative presentation. We will now continue to hear from our panelists, and I will introduce them briefly. So I'll begin with Ish Adagba. Dr. Adagba is a professor in the Department of Geography and Geology at UW-Stevens Point. His research focuses on comparative urban development, land use planning, political economy, and regional systems, shaped by his academic background, which is a master's in city planning from Clemson University and a doctorate in urban and public affairs from the University of Louisville. He co-directs the Center for the Small City at UW-Stevens Point. In addition to his professional work, Dr. Adagba is an avid Manchester United fan who enjoys playing soccer, spending time outdoors, and asking questions. He especially loves gardening and often spends his entire summer in his garden. Next, we have Allison Burr. Allison graduated from UWSP in 2018 with a bachelor's degree in waste management and communication and environmental studies minors. She has called the Stevens Point home for over a decade now and is serving her second term on the city council. Something she loves about Point is our green circle trail, the beautiful parks, and the lively downtown. Next, we have Nathan Sandwick. Nathan is an experienced educator and practitioner in the field of community development. In years past, he enjoyed co-leading University of Wisconsin's award-winning Community Vitality and Placemaking team, witnessing the launch of the lead for neighborhood development rating system and advocating for policies that expand transportation choice to reduce pollution and save money. Nathan studied urban and regional planning at University of Wisconsin-Madison with classmates who dreamed of communities designed for people. He grew up downstream in Salt Lake City. His first car was a Buick Century. Next, we have Greg Knight. Greg Knight is a retired USDA Forest Service Minerals Geology Groundwater Program Manager at the Chiquanka-Nicolet National Forest. He's chair of the Sustainability Commission for the City of Stevens Point. He volunteers at Schmeekley Reserve, is a voting poll worker, and is part of the Chain Gang Bicycle Club. Greg and his partner Barb are retired and moved to Stevens Point in 2023. Both are UW Stevens Point's alumni, and both like to be involved in the community and love the city of Stevens Point. And finally, we have Laura Shady-Stroik. Laura is a Wisconsin registered interior designer, small business owner, educator, and a commissioner on the city of Stevens Point's Planning Commission. She believes in safe, sustainable, equitable, and accessible places that reflect the heart of a community, organization, or homeowner. Thank you, everybody, for welcoming our guests, our panelists here. And I'll proceed asking some questions that we've prepared ahead of time, and then we'll also offer some chance for the audience to ask questions. So these questions are slightly geared towards individual panelists, but I think everyone can probably try their hand at answering them. And so our first question is kind of geared more towards Daniel. And the question is, many times in transportation or land use discussions and policy, less able-bodied people are left out of the equation. If new parking policies take place and we end up with less parking, how can less able-bodied people that don't qualify for a handicap tag get nearby parking?
Yeah, I think there are a couple different components to that answer. I'll try to keep it brief. I think Disability is not one thing, and the needs of people with disabilities, or even just on a spectrum of less able-bodied, maybe not to the point of you've got the ADA tag, you've got that parking space, but there are a lot of accessibility needs that aren't related to just like, do you have a parking spot? So that doesn't mean that the parking is unimportant. It means that let's actually get concrete when we're dealing with that issue as a community about identifying the needs, identifying them by bringing people with a range of mobility needs into the conversation from an early stage and into design discussions about the public realm, and then figure out what are the concrete problems that people are having and how can we address them. I will say this anecdotally, my wife uses a wheelchair. We have yet to have, specifically the lack of an ADA parking space be an obstacle to going somewhere we want to go. There are a lot of obstacles to going places we want to go together. There are a lot of obstacles to her having independent mobility. And there are things like, curb ramps that have a lip on them that she can't get over, or a grade that's inaccessible, or that shoot you right into traffic because of the way they're designed. Utility poles in the middle of the sidewalk, places that you don't have a button to open the door. I mean, there are 1,000 problems with accessibility. Parking, we have yet to have parking be one, and we've gone together to lots of places that don't have their own parking. So that's not to discount parking as an issue for accessibility, but it's not the only issue, and there's not one way to address it. And so I think that these conversations are nuanced. They need to be had with the affected people in the room, and we need to think about the whole door-to-door journey, what that looks like for people who have different sorts of needs. And the city is not passive in this. If you're not going to require a business to have a parking lot, and therefore that business also doesn't have its own ADA parking space, okay, what can we do in the public realm to ensure that people can get where they need to go, including ensuring that there is parking set aside for people with disabilities, with the doctor's note, with the placard, but also just for people who maybe don't have that, but are limited in how far they can walk. I've heard suggestions of, a local mobility program that sets aside parking on the street, in public lots, wherever, for a broader category of seniors, pregnant people, etc., who have a mobility need that maybe fall short of like ADA gap. There are a lot of ways. That was wordier than I intended. I'm sorry.
Any other panelists want to try to weigh in on that question? Alright. We will continue to the next question, and feel free to let that answer percolate a bit, and maybe you'll come up with something yourself. And so the next question is kind of geared towards Allison on the city council. So most parking policy agenda items get little bandwidth, or people share anger for new development taking away parking at city meetings. Maybe it's the planning commission, public works committee, city council. And so how do we develop healthier policies and parking management in the future?
Yeah, I think like Daniel said before, changing our zoning code. The zoning code is what reflects like the community's goals, promotes orderly development, and protects property values, while also just like the cohesion throughout a community or a city, right? So we're able to get rid of those minimums, or instead actually like enforcing a maximum number of lots instead of having a minimum number. And kind of like was said too, letting the business industry company determine their own lot sizes, because they probably know their customers' needs a little more than just a arbitrary number that was just kind of made up. And because then they have the financial interest to provide the correct number of spaces while also not overbuilding, right? I mean, because if it costs $5,000 for each spot, they're not going to want to just willy-nilly throw spots around. So they probably have a little bit better idea, what their parking lot needs are. And another thing would be enforcing more like incentive-based code, I guess. Like, say if you save X amount of the natural lot, that you're building on, you can build, let's say this number less lots or something like that. Or if you work in like solar panel or like clean energy or something like that, then you have shade for the vehicles in the lot, and they'd also have to be creating, I guess, more like green power. So then maybe they could build less lots that way. And I guess, yeah, just reiterating to what he said, just like expansive and generous lots. Really do keep people from like walking, biking, and just making communities less safe. Because what makes communities safe is like, eyes outside, like eyes, people being around and people sharing a space. And a wide open parking lot doesn't really, inspire safety or like make me feel too safe. And then it's part of the cycle that kind of leads to increased automobile dependence. I know I kind of drifted off of the main thing. But yeah, it's just really like looking at our zoning code and just, I guess I would be in favor of just doing away with parking in general.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on how do we develop healthier policies and parking management in the future?
Really easy one. Start talking to your legislators and the people who factor into having discussions about the zoning zone. Don't come to a council meeting angry. Have them have that discussion early or send that email so it's not bubbling and percolating. It's a lot easier to have a discussion with someone when you're not mad at them and they're not being yelled at.
Just want to add from the city sustainability commission standpoint, we need to do more micro planning of our different areas, like for example, our downtown business district. What do we actually need for parking in that business district based on actual data and information collected from the particular area to really figure out, how much parking do we need and what might work, what might not work. Talking to people to really find out, what the parking issues are, talking to the businesses and figuring out, what's the local solution.
Great. Yeah. Nathan,
Yeah, I was just going to add just for a point of reference, the most recent sort of local ordinance, not in this community, but I was working in recently. The most recent ordinance that I saw in parking was actually a parking maximum, and the way it was written was just simply, no more than 150% the established sort of minimum use. So kind of recognizes that those minimums are out there. They reference. Honestly, in practice, I think it's a little iffy as to whether you'll find a minimum for a very particular use. Some of the examples you shared were like bowling alleys. We all know what a bowling alley is. Sometimes it's a little bit more like, well, which category is this proposed development? But the last one I looked at was actually the maximum. I think there's probably a variety of reasons for that. It's probably not just the economics of parking and the fairness of that economics. It's probably also any number of other local considerations like impervious cover and runoff, everything else, all the other considerations that are a concern for many communities.
Okay. Good. Yeah, sounds like we heard a lot. But we can take a question from the audience, sure.
In your presentation, you talked about placing parking fees way of managing parking. I understand the pros and cons of that. But if you have a downtown bike office, that none of the property owners are owning their own parking, they rely on the government provided. And as most downtowns prove. These small businesses downtown are competing with big box stores, chain stores, the edge of town, which provide free parking. Aren't you adding a government tax onto small businesses downtown that can at least afford to pay that tax? And aren't you creating a disincentive for those property owners downtown that are already probably struggling?
That addressed to me.
Okay, go for it.
I think, first of all, I would actually dispute the notion that the downtown businesses are competing with the big box stores on the edge of town. I mean, in some cases, for some purchases probably, but I think they're fundamentally offering a different thing. There are things that a downtown Main Street does well that a big box shopping center will never do well, and vice versa. And so your downtown, you know, to the extent that you can make it a place that people want to be, people are gonna come. And then when they come, they're gonna pop into more than one store. They might make a purchase they had planned on making. And I think that's borne out in the data from really successful downtowns, that when you create a destination, the retailers benefit. And another thing the retailers benefit from is turnover in those on-street parking spaces. Often what we will see is you'll have, commercial corridor with a bunch of small storefronts. They don't have their own lot. And the owner comes in and the employees come in early in the morning and they park in the prime parking spots. And now their customers are circling around the block. Or somebody else comes and they take up that spot for the day. So actually managing that on-street parking with time limits and maybe with pricing encourages turnover, which actually encourages foot traffic into stores. And this is not just hypothetical. We've seen examples, we've seen studies done in neighborhood business districts where after these changes, retail foot traffic increases and sales increase. Probably not universally. And to be clear, I'm not advocating charging for parking for the sake of charging for parking or to discourage parking. When you should charge is when you have competition for those parking spots. When you have more people who want them than there are spaces available, and your drivers are ending up circling around the block hunting for a space. Well, that's not good for the retailer who wants that customer to find a space and come into their store and buy something. Often the way it shakes out in a downtown like yours is the prime parking spaces right on the main street, right in front of the businesses. Those might cost a little bit more because they're in the most demand. But if you go 2 blocks away, there's an underutilized lot where you can park it very cheaply or for free. Because the value of that, the parking is there. It's not scarce, it's just you might have to walk a couple blocks. So there are trade-offs to consider, but no, I don't think it's correct to say that it is a tax on struggling businesses. I think it can actually benefit.
Okay, well, let's, if there are any other panelists want to offer some words on that question?
Can I go back to, were you referring to the pricing, being asking if there's that concern the pricing, is that the policy change you're referring to? Mr. Gardner, what policy change were you referring to, Mr. Gardner?
Well, there was a talk about using fees as a management tool for moving cars along.
Yeah.
My suggestion was that, yes, that is a way of managing parking, and we have done occupancy studies in the downtown with the duration of occupancy. But my concern would be is if we added a cost of parking in the downtown area compared to where it's free at the edge of town, but you actually added a government tax on the businesses downtown effectively. And that discourages people from parking downtown. That discourages the businesses to become less competitive.
Yeah, thanks for your concern.
Well, by one quick response, it is a complex challenge, I think, an issue, and I think it's a lot about understanding what scene you're trying to create in downtown and what's distinct about that and what can be unique and attractive about that, compared to those other locations that we're comparing with. So how parking fits into that is a complex question. I think it's a lot of, devil's in the details, but yeah.
We do have a few more prepared questions. I guess if you can ask a quick thing, go for it.
So with the premium price parking, how do you account or take into account things like disabled parking or forcing people who are seniors or adults with disabilities who have mobility issues and maybe not a lot of money further away from better parking, where it becomes more of an inconvenience for them and does start to make those big box stores more attractive.
You want
I don't want to monopolize the panel here. I have a quick answer to that, which is, you can exempt people from having to pay, and that's a political decision that is within the local community's control. So that can be, the idea was thrown out, the idea was suggested to me, and I mentioned it earlier, that you could have a pass that is locally created, that is sort of a broader version of a disability placard, but you might make them available to senior citizen residents. You might make them available in different ways. And with, modern payment systems, which are usually either an app on your phone or a digital pay station, it's really easy to exempt people, or to give them discounts.
But that's a problem right there. That assumes that everyone uses a smartphone. That is ageist. Whether you realize or understand that or not. I mean, there are a lot of seniors who are perfectly comfortable on a smartphone, and there are just as many who don't own one.
So, if this is a pass that belongs to a person, it can also simply be by license plate. That vehicle is then exempt from having to pay the meter. I think there are a lot of ways to do it that don't place the onus on the individual to navigate a system that they aren't prepared to.
I guess like maybe a lot of people are maybe imagining full parking meters, right? And maybe the modern version of that, there's like a computer, right? I don't know, maybe you don't understand how they would work, but there's like a computer you type a number into that accounts for each space, and you don't use your phone, right?
The most common parking payment systems these days have a pay station, which is kind of like 1 meter per block instead of right in front of each individual stall. And you swipe a credit card there, or you put cash in the machine. You often give up your license plate number. From a matter of enforcement, I mean, you can, if there are people you want to exempt from having to pay for parking, you can do it via their license plate. Just this vehicle doesn't have to pay. It's often done with residential permits in mixed neighborhoods. So you have, I know an example of this in Portland, Oregon is the one I know best. There's a neighborhood that has a lot of small businesses, and their customers can come and park on the street and pay the meter. But if you live in that neighborhood, you have your residential permit on your windshield. You just park. You don't have to do anything. You won't be charged because you have that permit. So there are ways to get around this.
Let's go. Yeah.
Has anyone looked at using high occupancy vehicle parking as a management tool to reduce parking? I think it would have an application in places where you have employees. If you're going to carpool to get to work, I need to build less parking spaces. And the way the incentive would be, the person who's in a high occupancy vehicle gets the front row seat. The best parking spaces. And I think you could use it other places, but I haven't seen anybody use that. And it's easy to enforce now because every parking lot is under camera. And you don't have to, you're going to miss people, but every so often you can get them and have the incentive for people not to cheat. Anyone? Does anyone use that?
I think it's a fascinating question and idea. It's something I hadn't really thought of, but it's very relevant in the sense that, so much of the traffic that we have is people driving alone. Like we know that from the data. It's like so many of the car trips that we take, someone driving alone and then they bring them from their car and that takes up more space than the person. And so to kind of address that, that's kind of an elegant way of thinking about it.
Well, Federal Highways says that there are two dirty words in transportation, SOV and free parking.
You had a question?
How do you juxtapose high density housing, as in some of the buildings like we have over here for North Side Yards, with the realities that later happen with regard to, we didn't have enough parking, even though we planned for it, and it's running over into other city lots. to the extent where even that half that lot down by Riverfront Rendezvous is posted again for private parking, more or less permanent parking. And yet that was ignored during Riverfront Rendezvous, conveniently ignored during Riverfront Rendezvous. Because why? There isn't going to be enough parking there. And then you also have to juxtapose what is parking for recreational and temporary events that in some cases is needed, unless you want to put everybody on a shuttle bus. No, I mean, that's a solution. And you mentioned the parking kiosks. I think Stevens Point had parking kiosks for, well, maybe about 2 or 3 years, and then they were all out. Wasn't working. And Wisconsin Dells, you recognize density parking. Wisconsin Dells, you go down there, and they do have parking kiosks all over the place down there, and little signs that you basically take the number off that and you park. But they also have a really different personality. That's a city that goes from what, maybe 30,000 people in the wintertime up to 40,000 during the summertime. That doesn't necessarily occur at Stevens Point. I guess what I'm getting at is you really have to individualize things rather than making them to each individual city rather than having larger solutions. I had just put this in, I had a brother-in-law who was a former city planner. He said, oh, about 40 or 50 years ago, everybody had to have a city mall. And everybody was talking about walkable space on Main Street. And he said, where did that all go? Well, he said it was pushed largely, unfortunately, out of Madison. And people had good ideas. But when it turned out in the end, the malls are left, traditional malls. They just tore down I'm trying to think of one. Northridge, just demolished Northridge. And it had turned into a basically vacant building with a lot of problems around it. So, history, and then also that was positioned with these larger buildings.
Yes, thank you. It's good that we consider the local context, and I hope that's what we are trying to bring out of this discussion this evening. And so we'll continue with our prepared questions. The next one is for Greg. Some points of Stevens Point and Clover and others in Portage County have seen flooding due to a combination of larger stormwater events and impervious surfaces like streets and parking lots. Are you aware of examples of policy or infrastructure change that can mitigate flooding risk?
So, the Stevens Point area, the city in particular, depends on rainfall infiltration to manage stormwater runoff. So in other words, we don't have a lot of storm sewer. So the rainfall that you get has to infiltrate. Parking lots, if they're too large, will create a lot of runoff. Now the state does have stormwater management requirements. So that's what the big stormwater ponds are. The dilemma is that the bigger the hard surface area, the bigger the stormwater control pond that you may need. And all of that just takes up a lot of land. When you talk about older parts of the city of Stevens Point, there just isn't land available to create a lot of stormwater ponds to fit state mandates for stormwater runoff control. So, you have to use what you have in order to manage infiltration. So the amount of hard surface that you create, can have a significant impact on how much infiltration you can have and how much street flooding that you can have, as well as flooding of your properties if you don't have enough infiltration. So I think when we talk about balancing, how much hard surface, how much parking we need, it's also important from a flooding standpoint when we're trying to control flooding. And, I know that the city, works pretty hard at trying to make sure when they redo streets and such that they can do the best job they have to encourage infiltration to try and minimize the flooding.
Laura?
Can you just add on to that and give some examples of what you mean by encouraging infiltration? The Stevens Point is looking at using permeable concrete or any other options?
You know, that I don't know specifically as far as what, for example, the streets department's looking at, other than they do think about that, issue all the time. The business 51 reconstruction, for example, if you look at the details and the plans for that, they're trying to do a better job of managing infiltration as part of that whole reconstruction project. It hasn't gotten a lot of conversation in the public realm, but that's a real important aspect of that reconstruction, is to do a better job of minimizing infiltration. So, it basically boils down to is you do try to minimize your impermeable surfaces and try to create more permeable surfaces, whatever that might be, whatever materials that might be, to try to get as much infiltration as you can. The other thing to keep in mind too is you might say, well, why doesn't the city of Stevens Point or the surrounding communities build more stormwater sewer? The problem with that is that we're a relatively flat area, so there's a lot of limitations to how much runoff you can handle when you build a stormwater sewer system. The other aspect is that that's hugely expensive, and to try to add that in now to a city of this size would just not be affordable to do. So we are, what we have is what we have, and we have to work with that. There's no other better, engineering project that you can do that you can afford in order to get the runoff into the river so it doesn't flood your neighborhood. So in the era of increasing rainfalls for the state of Wisconsin, our average annual precipitation used to be 34 inches of rain. It's now considered 38 inches, which just means it rains more and it comes down in more intense storms. So it's an issue that we need to be focused on for this community. Otherwise, we're going to have more issues with flooding, and we need to manage that.
Anyone else want to weigh in on impervious surfaces?
Okay. That's fine. See if there's any questions.
Sorry, are you looking for audience questions?
Yeah, are there any?
Yep. Does anyone from the virtual audience wish to ask a question? Please raise your hand using the react button. I don't see any hands raised, and I don't see anything typed in the chat. So if there's still audience members who have questions, please go ahead.
For example, which parts of the Stevens Point Code do you think need to be changed? Specifically, which items would you change, need changing?
So that would take, and Stevens Point's in the process of rewriting their zoning code, and parking is going to be one of those topics. I don't know when it's coming up on the agenda, so to speak, but the ordinance.
Items would need changing.
Oh, no, not off the top of my head because I haven't read the whole thing recently, but I can tell you which zoning ordinance it is. Parking is in chapter 9.05.
Yeah. And then how will this affect the areas outside of the most urban parts of the city, the housing areas? How would this, parking proposals, how would it change parking out there?
Can you define out there? Are you talking like?
Yeah, I can define it. It'd be residential areas like in Stevens Point, it's like past Michigan.
Okay.
Because we got our city center here, and business goes out mostly to Michigan, and then there's residential area and then more business. So those areas that are not business oriented, but regular family neighborhoods, if you will.
Parkable streets?
Yeah, that's where they park. And will it affect the number of cars they can have? Those kinds of things. Does anybody know?
Well, I would need to know what policy is being proposed to say how it would affect anything really, in any part of town. I came to, this session is called Let's Talk Parking, right? So I'm here to talk parking. I'm glad there's people interested in parking. I think in general, a good rule of thumb for evaluating a policy change in this kind of space, and is our zoning code getting us what we want? Is to think carefully about the what ifs. Like, what if something was proposed? Does our code allow it? Is that something that contributes to our goals as a community, or not? And then so be mindful of what your code allows without the change. It's always good exercise, I think, to think through all the what ifs. Of what could a developer come along and propose? In the case of let's just say a big box store with this sea of open parking. If that's allowed, you need to be mindful of what the impacts of that are.
I guess I would want to caution how you phrase your question, because you said how will it change, and we're not really discussing any specific changes. So
Well, I basically was identifying or asking, which existing codes would need changing. In the briefing, they used, he used some specific examples of parking rates for Stevens Point. And so there's, when it comes down to the, making a decision instead of, just general theory, there's going to be specifics, and I wonder if anybody has targeted those.
And the mandates that have been kind of part of the discussion, those will be located in the zoning code. Depending on the type of building that is being built, will determine how many parking spaces will be required. When it comes to residential streets, I think that's in a different part of the city ordinances, and it goes by street. What is the parking rules on that section of street? And so if you're looking for a specific thing,
Yeah,
I guess there's different broad areas.
But mainly be a question for council members that are here or will be addressing the issue.
And hopefully we'll continue to have discussions about these things moving forward. Let's take some more audience questions. Andrea, Heather, no question.
Is one tool that you've heard of at all where when somebody actually works downtown and also lives downtown, do cities ever offer free parking in a lot that might be a couple blocks away from where they're working and living as a way to free up the parking spots then directly in front of those businesses for customers? And then those people might just have to walk a little bit further. That's one question I had. And then also, with Business 51, City Hall, Edgewater site, Kmart and Shopko, we have lots of, we've talked about, it seems like turf is being the option, permeable surfaces. And it seems like turf is always going in, but we haven't, at least what I've heard of, we aren't implementing anything else. Yes, turf is permeable, but what other solutions might be out there, and do cities at all incorporate things into requirements for the initial designs for those projects? Or if you're in a TIF district or a TID district, if you want to get any TIF incentives, have you seen any requirements for a specific type of design being implemented to ensure that there's parking and also stormwater mitigation without having parking spots or other spaces taken up by having those big areas collecting water half the time or part of the time when it's actually needed, but other times it's just sitting there and hopefully looking pretty too.
That's two questions. Daniel, did you have something on the first one?
Yeah, I think that's commonplace. And to the first question about offering parking, in a lot that's maybe a couple blocks away where there is available access parking, I think that's very common. I would encourage that, you know, if you have a lot of competition for the prime parking spaces, restrict those in a different way, charge people to use them, charge by the hour. But then locate, if you have an excess of parking in a broader area that's within walking distance of your downtown, take advantage of that. I've heard of cities using a valet system, you know, when it's like restaurant customers going to dine out in the evening, like, okay, you can actually park in the city-owned lot that's 3 blocks away from your destination and, you know, have a shuttle deliver you to your door. I know of some, Lockport, Illinois is one town that I know that does that. And certainly for residents, on my walk over here from my hotel, I saw one of the signs in a city lot that said, this is available for residential use by permit from 2:30 to 6 a.m. I think that's great. You've got parking. Nobody else is using it at that time of night. You have residents who can use it. I mean, ultimately the goal is that parking has all these negative consequences from runoff to heat to just the waste of land. So what we've already built, let's find ways to use it efficiently.
Just quickly, does anyone have any further stormwater solutions?
That's a whole other topic for a different day.
All right. Well, we are. All right. We'll take one more question. Back there.
I just wanted to ask again, I lived there at the university again, so that's been 8 years. It's been a long time. And I've seen all the changes that they've implemented about parking. And been to our advantage that they put in the kiosks in one way, because we have a one stall garage and very narrow to back out into traffic, people trying to find spots. And so do the students that live near me that have single driveway, so they have to move out for the other person to get in and out, back in again. It's pretty, you know, safety wise, it is not the best. But having the kiosks is the plus that has happened, which was unusual. I don't have problems with the cars all parking on the street. I can find a spot if I need to move my car there now. Because people, even though they're charging for it, problem has been people go further out into over by Clark Street and further out, so they walk. And now those people are seeing the problems that we had for years of people blocking your driveway or parking too close. You're not finding a spot and the snow, you know, are high up on the curves and stuff. So it's been an advantage for us. But I wonder, the city has thought further on this because they really aren't getting that revenue there that they thought they would get. And people do walk further from away to not have to pay. And then the other thing is that how can the university, as they've been building more, adding on to those, they're taking away from their parking if they can. They've lost so much more. They're doing one right now on this door, and it's going to take away the spots that were there for faculty and stuff that were in the back of it. I know what's going to happen. It's going to be a block from us. They're both right on my block down. They've already bought up the houses on. It was Street for Briggs, and that'll be, I don't know, next couple of years, end up being coming in a big parking lot, which I used to be farther away from the parking lot. They now have the building, now has this and the green space and things, but now there'll be another parking lot going into a neighborhood and taking out a whole block of houses that were there that could have been bought and maybe and housed people, but we've lost that. It's also taken away from our property values of our tax base. So see us doing more of that when we have a bigger entity, whether it be hospital, that would happen and it has happened in the past. But with the university adding on buildings, they had thought itself to a parking lot and then to a building eventually. Find out in my lifetime. So I'll have the snow plows and everything. I just wonder, are they thinking, why not have more parking in the center? Students would prefer it. We are a very compact university, which is really nice. So Claire, not like that, but utilizing each building and putting some parking in every building that they have, instead of just having buildings with no parking around it. Even if it was 20 spaces, it'd be that much better or helpful. And then how are we gonna get that so that you're not charging for those other spots where people are using them, so the city is not gaining anything. So it's like, I just wonder, there's gotta be a better way. We don't have parking rights or anything. You don't have, like the clinic used to do, Bryce Clinic used to have, they would get people on, they take a bus there, and people would park in that parking lot, they moved it, and so they could go on that. I just wonder how are they gonna work more with the university? Same thing about the cooperation with empty lots. We've got lots of empty lots on, during the breaks, holidays, that people could be using and that are in the neighborhood, maybe because they have company, whatever it is, because we don't have that space. And I just think we do need to think broader, and we do need to be talking with the entities and people that it affects. But anyway, I like that you're thinking about better ways to use what we have already.
Yep. Does anyone want to respond?
Yes. Yeah, so one way that parking is managed in some universities where there are small towns is that students are encouraged not to bring their cars to school. And then they get some sort of discount towards their fees, something that makes so that when they come, they use transit more, or they just bike. I think Students Point has a lot of
cars for students.
Yes.
lots of cars for students. And that's something that the university can decide. It's the trade-off, right? Because the university is thinking of revenues, fees the students will pay. But if you can give a discount, then there'll be less cars in town, then that will reduce the demand for parking.
Incentivize the students.
Yes.
Love it.
So, and then to piggyback on your comments about downtown malls, the gentleman in the red. Downtown malls, one of the things that killed downtown malls was big box stores at the edge of town and also outlets, because one thing they provided was free parking. And most of them now are becoming a destination, right? They don't just provide one kind of service. They're trying to become a destination. So do I want to drive downtown, get parking, or have to pay for parking? Or do I want to go to a big box store where I get free parking? I can shop all day, they have where I can eat, kids can play games. So they're becoming more of a destination. And that impacted the revenue stream of downtown malls. And that's why many of them died out.
Okay, well, that I think we'll deal with our question time. We're past our time, so I'll hand it back over to Trevor here.
Thank you so much, everybody. Let's thank Daniel. There's a lot left, 6 steps on the way up. Thanks again. Have a good night.
Thank you, everybody. And for our listening audience, thanks for tuning in. So, have a good night, everyone.